can we talk about the political solution, Matt Goodwin? Because you're there speaking at the Reform UK conference, predicting that there's going to be a revolution in British politics. I mean, I completely agree with you. But does that mean that you think Nigel Farage can be Prime Minister?
I don't think there's ever been as much space in British politics for Nigel Farage and the self-described People's Army as there is today. And I've been looking at British politics for 20 years. And Dan, what I see is a incredibly unpopular incumbent Labour government, which is only going to become more unpopular over the next 5 years. I see a very tight economic environment, low growth, lots of debt, declining public services, a broken model of mass immigration, which is taking more out of the economy, Dan, than it's putting in. I see broken borders. I see lawlessness. I see the advance of woke ideology in our schools, in our civil service, in the public sector institutions. And I see rising levels of concern over these issues. Dan, as we're speaking today, the number one issue in the country in all of the polls is not actually the economy and the cost of living, it is immigration. And you've got this real potent mix of people who are desperately concerned about what's happening to the country they love, who are simultaneously struggling to get to the end of the month, worried about prices, worried about where the future of economic growth is going to come from, and who aren't getting the answers from the established political class. So for Nigel Farage and Reform, and I have to say, I was at the conference, I spoke at the conference, it was probably the most polished and professional conference that I've been to date. It was very well organized. There weren't any hecklers, unlike at the Labour conference. The audience was very committed. They were very engaged. I tell you though, Dan, there's one challenge to Nigel Farage that I think very few people have picked up on, and it's this. The challenge will not be generating demand, because there's so much of that in British politics at the moment. The challenge is going to be overcoming apathy, overcoming a sense among the British people that it's too late, a sense that the country is gone, a sense that nobody can make a difference. And I tried to give a nod to that in my speech. And I also discussed this with Nigel and some of his team. I said, what I sense at this conference that I've not sensed at any previous Brexit Party event, UK Independence Party event, is not just support for the movement, Dan, but is a palpable sense of urgency, a sense that if something doesn't start to change soon in this country, then it will be too late. And so apathy is that big challenge, that big obstacle that I think is facing Nigel Farage and the movement, and they're going to have to find a way of overcoming it.
Now, you were a big part before the election of encouraging Nigel to stand, because remember, initially he didn't, but you were saying, yes, he could win in Clacton, and actually he would take other MPs into Parliament, which is what happened. So putting your data pollster hat on for a moment, what actually has to happen on a practical basis for Nigel to be Prime Minister at the next election? Does there have to be a merge between Reform UK and the Conservative Party, otherwise they cannibalise each other? Or does there have to be a deal where, for example, Reform UK might take all the red wall seats and the Tories would challenge the Lib Dems? I mean, from a practical basis, what has to happen politically under our first past the post system for Nigel to have a shot of entering number 10?
Look, I think ultimately the answer to this question is going to depend on your own politics. Now, my view would be Reform would be insane to do a deal with the Conservative Party. In fact, one of the lines that I had in my speech was that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different outcome. Well, arguably, if you vote Conservative again and again and expect a different outcome, then, good chances are you're insane. And I think for many people within and around the Reform movement, doing business with the party that presided over the liberalization of the immigration regime, that lost control over the borders, that never really took levelling up and investing in areas outside of London seriously, that basically laughed in the face of many ordinary British people on these issues. My view would be, Reform should hold their nerve, should continue to critique and attack the two big parties and present a credible, compelling alternative. And what I suspect, Dan, is they may well replace the Conservatives at the local elections next year. I think they'll beat the Conservatives in Wales. Some really important elections coming up in Wales. I think we'll probably have some by-elections where Reform will finish ahead of the Conservatives. And all of this is going to add to this sense of momentum behind this People's Army, that actually the answer here is not just to bring back a party that is broken. Its brand has become toxic. As Nigel Farage said at the Reform conference, he doesn't care who becomes leader of the Conservative Party because the brand is so irreparably damaged that I think Reform will be tempted to go it alone. Now, that's going to make things difficult, without question. That's going to make beating the Labour Party without question. But the thing that's going for Reform, Dan, is we've never had levels of churn, levels of volatility in our political system like we've had today. I mean, we've just gone from a massive Boris Johnson majority in 2019, 80 seats, to an enormous Labour majority only 5 years later. Now, why is that? Well, that's because voters are no longer tribally loyal. You know, they are floating around freely. And if they come to the conclusion that the answer in 2029 is actually none of the big parties, and the answer is an alternative that is much closer to the values of the majority on these enormous totemic issues like immigration, and they conclude that movement is credible, then they may well shift en masse again. So, you know, my view, my advice to Nigel Farage and so on, not that they necessarily need my advice, but it would be hold your nerve, keep going, keep professionalizing, see where you are in 2027, 2028.
So I'm interested to know what you think about some of the criticism of Nigel from the right over the past week, because there is a view that he has slightly moderated his message when it comes to two big issues, the demographic change in the UK and mass deportation. So I want to show you just a couple of little bits of this interview that Nigel conducted with Stephen Edgington of GB News, and I'll get you to respond off the back.
Do you think that immigration represents a major threat to Britain from a demographic perspective? So in the last 20 years, the white British population has declined from 87% to 74%. Is that a concern of yours?
No, that's not a concern of mine. What is a concern of mine is, in many cases, the lack of integration. We see that writ large by the new kind of politics that's emerging, sectarian voting along religious lines. I never really thought I'd see that in England in my lifetime. I mean, I grew up seeing...
Was that the right answer, to say demography doesn't matter?
I'm not entirely sure that is what Nigel Farage was saying. I think what he was saying was that we've moved beyond the discussion about race, and that demographic change and the pace of change that's been undermining the integration of our country and undermining a sense of shared values and belonging is critically important to our politics. Now, I understand why many people on the right of British politics would perhaps watch that interview and say, actually, I feel really concerned about the decline of the white British group, because the decline of the majority group is a symbol that many people take as being a proxy for the health of the nation, if you like, that the majority group is seen as a symbol of that nation. And that's why, for example, down in America and the UK and elsewhere, we often find that minority communities feel just as anxious about the decline of the majority group, because they too associate the majority group with that nation. So I think there are lots of people who will feel very concerned about the pace of change and the extent to which cities, towns in the country are becoming majority minority, if you like. But Nigel Farage's job, being in Parliament and leading the Reform Party, is not to appeal solely to the right of British politics. His job now is to build a coalition of voters that can extend well beyond 15% of the national vote. So if you like, what I think we're going to see now is really a tension, if you like, between, true believers, ideologues, and political realists. And if you are, and especially in the first past the post system, Dan, if you want to go from 14% of the national vote, which is what Reform got at the general election, and 5 MPs, to 30% of the national vote and potentially coming within the realm of winning a general election, you have to dramatically expand your coalition. And maybe I'd rephrase it between, you know, a purist and pragmatist message, right?
Yeah.
And I think ultimately that's what you saw in that interview with Nigel Farage.
So he's going to
Edgerton.
moderate a bit, because there was another key part from the interview about mass deportations, which I want to get you to comment on too. So have a look at this. Best time of year, isn't it? Football is back. We're talking Premier League in the UK and in the US, NFL Sundays and college football Saturdays. And with that comes the glorious grind of fantasy football lineups. This is where your inner manager comes alive, setting the perfect fantasy roster, screaming at your TV and making last-minute waiver moves that either make you a hero or the guy everyone ridicules in the group chat. But listen, while you're over here making sure your fantasy team is dialed in, don't let your personal grooming become the guy that gets left on the bench. Because let's be honest, nobody wants to fumble their grooming routine. This is where Manscaped's Performance Package 5.0 Ultra comes in, acting as your all-in-one grooming playbook. From keeping things sharp down below with the Lawnmower 5.0 Ultra to taking care of those rogue era nose hairs with the Weed Whacker 2.0, this is the lineup that'll keep you looking and feeling like a champ on and off the field. It will make you feel clean, confident, and ready to dominate your fantasy league. So the Lawnmower 5.0 Ultra Groin and Body Hair Trimmer, it's the franchise player of your grooming roster. It has precise trimming capabilities, it's reliable, efficient, and gets the job done without fumbling. Whether it's for a date night, a weekend tailgate, or just everyday grooming, this is the tool you want on your squad. Now, no one wants a nose or ear hair making some sort of guest appearance on game day, so the Weed Whacker 2.0 handles those details like a pro, keeping you neat and ready to go. No missed tackles in your grooming gang. And we have 2 free gifts to offer you today as well. The Boxers 2.0 Midnight Bravo and the Shed 2.0 Toiletry Bag, premium gear to ensure you're always ready for action, whether at home and on the road. So join the 10 million men worldwide who trust Manscaped like me and get ready for kickoff by heading over to manscaped.com. If you use the code Outspoken at checkout, you will get 20% off your entire order and free shipping. So trust me, you'll be drafting the real MVP of grooming this season. So let me repeat the website, www.manscaped.com. Use the code Outspoken at checkout for 20% off and free shipping. Stay on top of your grooming game and be ready for anything the season throws your way.
It's a political impossibility to deport hundreds of thousands of people. We simply can't do it. At the moment, it's a political impossibility.
But is it your ambition?
No. Yeah, I'm not going to get dragged down the route of mass deportations or anything like that. Yeah, I mean, people are always going to come and go, and we are a country that's engaged in international trade, and we have relationships around the world through the Commonwealth, etc. But yeah, we have to aim at a balanced migration policy.
But net zero still means hundreds of thousands of people coming into Britain, immigrants coming into Britain. Isn't that too many?
It may well be, but we have to start somewhere.
Trump says in America that he wants mass deportations. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of illegal immigrants are in Britain at the moment. Some estimates say the number could even be in, 1 million plus. So do you support deporting all of those people?
It's impossible to do. Literally impossible to do.
In terms of the atmosphere in Britain, are you concerned that there is a rising level of anti-white hatred?
I'm just concerned about a deeply divided society.
Now you'll see it was actually UKIP that put all of that together, Matt, and they have said Tommy Robinson supporters are welcome, Katie Hopkins is welcome, because Katie said that she was banned from the Reform conference. Watch this.
So just so you know, that's my commitment to our side, right? I don't believe in the division. I understand what Nigel and Reform are doing, but please know they won't allow me anywhere near them. It's not because I won't be there.
Okay, so where do you stand? Was Nigel right to rule out mass deportations, and is Reform UK right to say no to Tommy Robinson supporters?
I think the first thing to say is it depends what groups we're talking about in British society, and that wasn't entirely clear to me from the question that Stephen was asking. So to give you some examples, if we have 1.2 million illegal migrants in Britain, which is estimated to be somewhere between 800,000 and 1.2, and we can remove those people to their countries of origin, then we should be doing what we can to remove those people from the country. If you have somebody with dual nationality who has been convicted of grooming or sexually exploiting young white girls in Northern England, as I've argued on my Substack, those people should be deported, and we should be applying pressure on countries like Pakistan, which we can do through visa arrangements and other things. We should remove them from the country. If we have 10,000 foreign national criminals down in our prisons, and we simultaneously can't find enough spaces for criminals in the UK, we should be doing whatever we can to deport foreign nationals out of our prisons. Now, those things I think you can do something about. I suspect what Nigel was saying was that within the much broader debate about deporting immigrants per se, it's just simply too broad and politically impractical to do something on that issue in Britain in 2024. So there are things that we can do, things that I think are fair and just and respectful to the British people, around people who break up the law, around people who engage in hideous practices, around people who enter the country illegally. We should be detaining them and we should be deporting them immediately, not giving them amnesty, which is what Yvette Cooper and the Labour government are wanting to do. But I think where Nigel Farage was drawing a line was saying, actually, that doesn't spill into mass deportations of immigrants per se, because, how are we defining those people? And I think that's the issue that we just want to be aware of. In terms of the other issues, that's a question for the Reform leadership, Dan. I'm still not a member of the Reform Party. Who they choose to let into their conference or not is ultimately up to them. I think, I could just tell you a little bit about my own journey, if you like, in that
I was wondering if you were thinking about joining, because a lot of people are hoping, Matt, that you might end up being part of a Reform UK cabinet, Home Secretary, for example.
Well, Dan, let me just say, and I would say this to everybody in Reform, there is no such thing as a perfect political party.
Mm-hmm.
And there is no such thing as a perfect political leader. But what there are in politics are vessels and vehicles that you can use to apply pressure to the political system and bring about real change. Now, I think everybody who is in Reform, based on the conversations I've had, is in it for that reason. They want to use a vehicle to apply pressure to the big parties and take on the elite consensus in this country. Now, that's certainly how I view the Reform movement. It's a vehicle, it's a springboard into applying pressure. Because if you look at the last 20 years, Dan, the big story in British politics, I would argue, is that real political pressure on the elite consensus does not come from within the old parties, but comes from outside the established political system. That was the story of UK Independence Party and immigration. That was the story of Brexit. That's the story now with Reform. You cannot trust the Conservative Party to bring about this change. I certainly wouldn't. But I think you could learn that lesson and apply pressure from outside the system. And in a sense, then, if you look at it through that lens, it doesn't really matter who has what kind of alliance with what kind of party, with what kind of organization, as long as millions of people are walking into the polling station and are actively rejecting a status quo that isn't working for ordinary working class people, the forgotten majority, that's enough. And, my view on politics has always been maybe more pragmatic than some people, in that ultimately, Dan, maybe like yourself, I'm interested in getting things done and changing things, not wasting time arguing over ideological purity or who likes who and who dislikes who. I think ultimately the stakes are so high right now, particularly over the next 5 years, that we need to think much more seriously about how do you bring about change.
I couldn't agree more. And it just makes me realize when you say that, how ridiculous so much of the coverage of politics in the UK is, because it's all about Westminster parlour games that the MSM are obsessed with and never about the issues that are actually destroying people's lives. Thank you so much for watching Dan Wootton Outspoken. Please do subscribe if you want lots more clips and interviews like that. Plus, if you want to watch our totally uncensored after show, then visit www.outspoken.live.